This is an interview conducted with Alberto Burquez by Helen Ingram and Wendy, Gwynn, Laird Benner in 2010.
All right, the project is really about how long-standing network ties may help transcend what seemed to be a really bad time along the border. And our argument is that despite the contemporary and very discouraging bad relationships due mostly to actions within the United States on the U.S. Mexico border, nonetheless, progress has happened, and there's lots of specific examples of progress. And we're sort of proposing that progress is due to long-standing person-to-person ties based less on communication than a shared commitment to the place, often expressed in emotional terms, but also deep knowledge about the Pinacate and the Upper Gulf, long-term and persistent commitment. So that's really what we're trying to document, I think, at this point.
Right. If I understand well, what you are broadly asking is how network ties,
right,
mainly on a personal, one-to-one basis, do affect issues on the border.
Environmental issues, and when we talk about person-to-person ties, among the things that we are discovering is how important being someone's research colleague or student, and the sort of legacy thing of getting engaged in field work and how that carries through throughout a lifetime. When I spoke to Ezekiel, he talked about his dissertation and how that introduced him to the Pinacate, and even though he hated it to begin with, it's been haunting him ever since.
Right, well, probably the Pinacate remind him of many places in his native Argentina.
That's what he said.
And it's very difficult for me to envisage or to try to conciliate how things change on a one-to-one basis, because we have done this all the time. Since a long time ago, probably, let's say 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago perhaps, we have established strong ties with our American counterparts. And we have started working in a more equal relationship in terms of academic issues, and of course related to environmental issues like conservation or sustainability. It's very difficult for me to relate these to the actual climate of the law, particularly this new law in the state of Arizona that apparently is spreading to other states in the state. Do I understand correctly?
Right. I think we're not very focused.
These two things or not?
Yeah. We're not so focused on this new law. We're not very interested in the new law.
Right,
it's only that there's a general sense that not much is happening of a positive nature right now, that we're in a lull.
You know what, actually, Alberto, would be really great is to start with, how did you come to this work that you've been doing? You've been researching and studying and exploring the Pinacate and the desert, and you've got students you've worked with, you've been up to the U of A, you collaborate. Mm-hmm. How did you start? What was it in your childhood? Were you out camping? What got you motivated to spend your entire life's work in this hard, difficult, complicated area? Let's start there, and then we'll get to the network.
Okay. Well, probably as happened with Ezekiel, I happened to grow in an area, in a very arid area. I was born in Hermosillo, Sonora, and the desert became part of my early experience. And I used to go on long forages through the desert, hunting for quail or rabbits to eat them, and probably depredating big chunks of the desert in the process when I was young, secondary school, let's say, spreading buffalo grass at that time because I was told by my peers that buffalo grass was a marvel and will make cows grow. Of course, when I got an academic training, I started to understand many things that I had taken for granted before. So I went to Mexico City. I worked in the mountains of Mexico City, and then I started working in the wet tropics. I did a lot of work in the wet tropics, and finally ended in Cambridge doing my PhD, going back to Mexico City, and by a serendipitous path, I happened to be offered, when coming back to the National University under a tenure track contract, to start a research station in northwestern Mexico. And that they were offering it to me because they knew I was born in the area, and I knew the area, and I had an involvement, not scientific, but more emotional. I probably had a knowledge of the area that will allow me to develop research projects in the region. And so in the early 1990s, I came to Sonora and was faced for the first time in an organized way with the task of trying to devise research projects in this wonderful area that I have idealized for a long time in my times in defense of Cambridgeshire or in the wet tropical rainforests of Mexico City. So it was great to rediscover the desert when coming back, and of course, and this relates to your particular question, the first aim I had was to establish links with my colleagues in the University of Arizona and the Arizona State University and other regional universities that were doing studies on arid lands. So I went to the U of A and to the Arizona State University and started establishing links, because all the tradition of doing deep studies, environmental studies, and by environmental I mean everything from ecosystem dynamics to population genetics, was done mainly by North American researchers, and there was very little research done by Mexican researchers that were more based in the Chihuahuan Desert, in the southern Chihuahuan Desert, the tropical rainforests, the deciduous forest, and particularly the highlands of central Mexico. So, in a sense, we were among these first scientists of the new, of the environmental quotation marks era coming to the Sonoran Desert. Mm-hmm. And the support we got from our colleagues in the States, from our American colleagues, was extraordinary. Really, we had great input from many researchers in the States, some others ignored us, and that's the usual thing in the academia, you see. But really, without the support from people from American universities doing studies in the Sonoran region, in the northwestern Mexico region, would have been very difficult to start working in Sonora.
Who were some of those key contacts that you were collaborating? I know you were working with Richard Felger. Were there
Yes.
others? Who else? Bill Shaw, did he interface with you much? Are there others?
I did my master's in Mexico City when a researcher now working at the UFA was doing his postdoc, and he was my supervisor in Mexico City, and is Laird Benner, that is highly theoretical work and highly academical. So Larry was very, very important to establish the first contacts. Then Richard Felger, Paul Martin. Paul Martin was extremely influential, not only on me, but on most researchers doing environmental work in northwestern Mexico. Cecil Shalby with reptiles. Ray Turner, of course, with whom I still do some field work along with Richard. Who else? Tom Van Devender. Tom Van Devender was a very important link when doing vegetation studies also in the Sonoran Desert. Dr. Mink in Arizona State University. Dr. Pinkava. At that time when I came here, sorry?
No, it's just that unfortunately we didn't get all of our windows closed.
I had the great opportunity of meeting Howard Scott Gentry, and it was great talking to him and learning from him. Just by, you see, you don't need to work with someone, but if you come close to these people, you also get inspiration and motivation to do work. And knowing people like Howard Scott Gentry or Paul Martin was also very important, not only in terms of the scholar work, but also by raising in a simple conversation basic issues. I learned so much from Paul Martin by just talking to him, and he pointing me out and saying, Alberto, I remember very well, for example, Paul Martin telling me in Alamos in a memorable trip we did with him, Hela Martinez and me, and saying, don't you think, Alberto, that because I was questioning the transformation of the land by buffalo grass, and all these swaths of forest that were destroyed and replaced by buffalo grass. And then he said to me, well, think, Alberto, that about 10, 20,000 years ago, glyptodons were doing all the all the work that the caterpillars are doing now, and probably the land looked just like the one you are looking at now. And that remark made me really change my perception of things. And of course, there are many anecdotes like that in which one person, a very enlightened person like Paul, can steer the course of things by just mentioning a key issue to a young scientist, because I was young at that time.
It's one of the things that we've heard from, for example, Francisco Zamora and Bill Shaw yesterday, is that shared experience of field work has been somewhat foreign to Mexico academics, and yet is a growing thing now. Students are out in the fields, and their argument is that it's somewhat essential to get out there, work with the land, look at it, touch it, feel it, experience. So it sounds like you did quite a bit of that in your early days. How important do you think it's been in formulating your perspective?
You say field work by itself?
Yeah.
Yes, I think before there was this Aristotelian view of things in which you can describe things by just quickly peering through. But of course, deep knowledge of things is only achieved through a deep involvement with the subject of study. In this case, the need for a lot of field work, just as the early pioneers in the knowledge of the Sonoran Desert or any other field of knowledge had to devote. Spend a long time in the field and you will get deeper understanding of that issue.
It's interesting that you were in the field when you and Paul had. It's interesting that you were in the field when you and Paul had this conversation. You were jointly observing something together. So even though you may not have been doing research together, you were certainly having a collaborative experience, huh?
For sure, I owe a lot to Paul, to Richard, with whom I spent a lot of time in the field, not doing elaborate experiments, just walking and collecting. For example, Richard is a taxonomist, and he wants to collect specimens to increase the connections, to fill up the hard disk, the new occurrences of plants throughout the range of distribution of that plant. But many conversations occur at the time, as you mentioned. Just as happened with Paul, I had conversations with Richard or with Tom Van Devender or with many researchers that really leave a deep imprint and make you think about new projects. So of course, I've been doing also research that is in many ways very different from what Paul or Richard do. I am more on the line of the hardcore research that Jose Sarucan, my mentor, my first mentor at the National University of Mexico, did on deep population ecology, or with Laird Benner, that really we use the scientific method to its utmost consequences, rather than trying to understand or describe systems. And of course, there is this heavy criticism within the academia to the taxonomists and the people that make catalogs like these wonderful books by Richard, and don't understand the deep significance of just providing the foundations for further research. If we don't know what we are going to study, or we don't understand things that are there, how can we make deeper questions? So even in my institution that happens. Say there's heavy criticism to the descriptive part of research versus the hypothesis-driven portion of science. And of course, many of the issues, going back to the borderlands idea, many of the issues that happen along borderlands are not concerned with hypothesis-driven questions that are more universal in nature, but by local processes of description.
Good. That's exactly where I wanted to go next, was to sort of connect this research to actions such as the designation of reserves or the establishment of programs. Sort of in your experience, how has this work fed into actions either internationally or by the Mexican government leading to preservation?
And let me add, can I add one thing I want to add? And you had already been doing so much work on the ground before the designation happened. And how did that basis and the networks you'd established get to ultimately the designation of these institutions, the biosphere reserves?
Well, I think there are many issues here. One is the historical moment. Say, designation of reserves had to happen at that time and couldn't happen before because simply there was not the political interest or the bilateral involvement. So even though the United States have this long tradition of setting up reserves that Mexico tried to do in that golden age about 100 years ago, the determinants in both countries were so different that designation of reserves was forgotten until the moment arrived. And probably the Pinacate is one of the first reserves that really enter, to put an example, the Pinacate or El Vizcaíno, that is not really border, but is close to, were the first reserves that really came into this new era of reserve designation. And that obeyed an accumulation of knowledge. For example, in the Pinacate, the work by Ezequiel Escurra was very, very important, and Richard Felger, of course, was very, very important to highlight the value of preserving that piece of the environment. The government had to fulfill this conservation agenda in a world that was more and more demanding of conservation actions, and of course there was that part of diplomacy in which counterparts in both sides of the border were really striving to set up reserves that were transboundary, and that started, for example, in the Pinacate, this effort started in the Kennedy area, in the Kennedy era. But only coalesced many years later. I don't think deep hypothesis-driven knowledge would have benefited the establishment of reserves. It was more this broad descriptive work in which we knew how many plants were growing in the Pinacate, how many geoforms were present, how vegetation varied along gradients that were important to set up the reserve, instead of knowing how strong was the gene flow between these two populations and how this affected the evolution of the populations. These questions have not much bearing on setting up reserves, but the work by descriptive work, like the works by Richard or by Ezequiel, had a much more profound impact on setting up the agendas for maintaining these reserves on the borderlands. I think that answered. Perhaps I'm talking too much.
No, it's perfect. You're not talking too much. This is great. I'm just wondering if we can push this characteristics of such researchers a little further. They have to be willing to do things that are not necessarily what their academic colleagues might think are cutting edge, but are there other characteristics of such researchers? Is there a sort of commitment to place, to doing your research in one place for a long period of time? So in that sense, persistence. Is there some orientation toward having an impact in the real world instead of just upon one's colleagues? What would you say about such people? And we're trying to interview a number of them, but I don't think they're the usual kinds of people one find in universities or necessarily places outside this interesting laboratory.
Well, there is this big trend in which we have the academic work has moved from the description of systems or even patterns into much more smaller questions that you will answer through experimentation. And the most obvious evidence of that is the relevance of molecular biology right now, in which we look for very important questions, but on a very, very small scale, even impact scale. Also, they can have a high economic reward. The people involved in producing the basics for conservation, monitoring, making the people interested in making these catalogs, or studying broad patterns at the ecosystem level, really I really think are at a very have a very heavy handicap compared to the traditional modern day researcher that asks what's the switcher of the gene LDAP in Arabidopsis thaliana. The production of a book like the plants of northwestern Sonora, that wonderful book that Richard Felder produced, are really at a big disadvantage within universities because there is no premium to produce such work. This work needs many, many years of permanence in a single site, just doing the very same task, that is collecting, analyzing, looking at distributions, making catalogs, writing descriptions. And this sort of work does not have a premium. The premium is right now is more on quantity. How many papers do you publish? What is the impact of the papers you publish? How many readers, potential readers, you will have? How many people will cite your work? Could it be patented or not? Etc. Things that what I call numerology. We are in the era of academic numerology, and I think that has strong detrimental effects on, particularly on long-term research that produces monumental works like Tribb and Wiggins' Flora of the Sonoran Desert. It's very difficult now to produce such works unless you are the atypical individual that don't care about the academic demands and just keep doing because you have a commitment with the land, with the region, because you have set your priorities very clearly, and you don't care about this stairway to heaven. you just go up and up and up, acquiring more titles and getting more merits to finally end as a emeritus professor at the university. If you say, in the case of Richard, I think is very, very illustrative. Richard is not permanent staff of any university, despite being probably the most important botanist in southwestern United States, northwestern Mexico. He's so central to most work on vegetation and plants, and but he has no formal affiliation with the university, but by being associated to universities.
So, Alberto, one of the things we've also been wondering is how important institutions are as opposed to individuals, and then the networks, those three factors. Do you think that the Pinacate is better and the Upper Gulf are better off today as a result of the Biosphere Reserve? Or could the kind of work that continues and the preservation of the species have been done without it? Is it ecologically in a better place now than it was then?
No, for sure. The presence of institutions has been of paramount importance to many things, to conservation efforts, to the preservation of species, to the conservation of particular monuments or pieces of land, to the stopping of depredation or depredation of the land or transformation of the land. The presence of the biosphere reserves that are also now biosphere reserves of UNESCO has been central to the permanence of of the land as is, or to even to the restoration of some pieces of land. Say, without the Pinacate Reserve, you will probably see more and more transformation of that wonderful area of the Pinacate, particularly along the Rio Sonoita, or in the Upper Gulf. The vaquita would be in even worse condition or even extinct if there was no presence of the biosphere reserve in the Upper Gulf. For example, the other day I was reading the newspaper looking at the relevance of Profepa actions in the Upper Gulf, in which they confiscated 11 pangas boats that were reincident. They were fishing after many warnings inside the reserve, and well, that would have never happened if the areas were not protected by a proactive institution like CONAMP that has devoted funds and people to the monitoring and the presence simply being there on these biosphere reserves. And I think the biosphere reserve system in Mexico has progressed a lot. It's a great system, has made a big difference, and the institution by itself really has changed things.
And is that due to funding and enforcement? And because that's been a criticism of reserves, not only on our side, but as well in Mexico, that you can have these paper designations, but without resources, without somebody caring for them in some way. So,
well, that was the past. Say, in the past there were so many paper designations. Some of them forgotten, as I've written in Dry Borders, in our chapter in Dry Borders.
Yes, I'll look
in which,
at that
for example,
again.
for Hermosillo or Nogales, there were these reserves decreed in the 1930s that were forgotten, and no one cared about the reserve because there was no institution behind to keep or to enforce the decree. Now the CONAMP has got some funding from the Mexican government, funding from private enterprises like Cemex, that is one of the largest cement producers in the world, based in Mexico, and of course from binational agreements in which funds are allotted for protection of land within decreed reserves, as happens in the Alto Golfo and the Pinacate, in which funds, I know, for example, that funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service come into the Pinacate because they want to know more or to protect or to increase the buffer area around the American reserves. So I don't see a problem related to funding. It's more a problem related to how politics have to be driven on the application of these funds. Mm-hmm. One of the things I see, for example, in the Mexican Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas, CONAMP, is that most funds are funneled into operation of the reserve, and little is invested in knowing what they have. And in that sense, probably will be relevant either to set a new department within CONAMP to do research or to orientate research, or to have satellite agencies that will interact with CONAMP and NPS too, to research, particularly along these reserves along the border.
How about Mexican NGOs? We've heard that in the last decade or so there's been, and particularly in recent years, there's been a rise of Mexican non-governmental organizations that have ability to transcend the change of personnel that happens in Mexico when new elections occur, and people in agencies change, and that have served as places for researchers, perhaps the descriptive, deeply informed researchers that you're talking about, can hang out when they're not in official positions. Do you think that Mexican non-governmental organizations, and Mexico has not had a big reputation for civil society, that they're coming to play a more important role?
Yes, I think they have increased their role in later years. Not as much as we wanted. There are tax exception incentives to go into conservation. You can funnel funds for NGOs that will go into the environment. Not only in the environment, the NGOs have made a big change in Mexico. NGOs aiming for niños de la calle, for example, or the migrants, or terminally ill people, are becoming more and more important in Mexico. And of course, the environmental NGOs related to environmental issues are much more important now than in the past. The thing we have to bear in mind is that there is a big imbalance. When you compare Mexico with the United States, there's a big imbalance in terms of income. And of course that is reflected in many things, like conservation or funding for NGOs. So NGOs in Mexico can get funding from international sources, and that have flourished for a long time in Mexico. Were the traditional NGOs, but the increase of recent NGOs, of new NGOs in Mexico, I think has made a big difference. But still, their impact is very small, because even if you get a 100% increase in NGOs in the last 10 years, to put a figure, I don't know the real value, but should be about that. Doesn't make any sense, because you go from 5 to 10.
So in a comparative sense, then you'd probably put more emphasis on these collaborative relationships across the border of investigators such as yourself, and that long-term commitment to improving the knowledge base as a sort of incentive for action and as a continuing presence, just in terms of your own ideas of what's most important. You'd put that ahead of these non-governmental organizations.
Well, I think we have very, very different objectives. Saying one, we want to know more, we want to learn more, we want to answer questions, and this is the side in which I am.
Right.
In the other side, you want to preserve, you want to extend to the social environment the relevance of conservation or sustainability. You want to change the local ways to be more environmentally friendly. And I think both are very important. So we want to know more, but at the same time we want to really find ways of using the environmental services in a wiser way. And of course, both go together and in parallel. So we're in dire need of knowing more, but also in making a more a better use
Right.
of environmental services.
But do you think I just want to explore the relationship a little bit here, because it seems to me that there have been times when there's sort of been an absence of groups pushing to make things better, and it's only been the knowledge base and the realization that species are disappearing that becomes a spur to action. So I'm wondering how you see the connection between knowledge and action here.
Very thin. Probably there has been a much higher emphasis on knowledge, despite the paucity on the efforts related to knowledge rather than action. I was recently in a workshop, in the Global Cactus Assessment workshop in Phoenix, with people from Sheffield and of course some American universities, and was great.
Dan Sarowitz's meeting, right?
Sorry?
That was Dan Sarowitz's meeting at ASU?
No, it was it was Kevin Gaston and Company meeting at the Desert Botanical Garden.
Okay.
And my wife, Dr. Martinez, came with me. She was very kind in coming with me in the car and having a great time and working a lot in the hotel. Meanwhile, I was attending the workshop. And we were both amazed. And it's not the first time, but always happens when we go to the States and find these hordes of people willing to do work, to be volunteers. And we're just asking people from the garden, how many volunteers do you have? And they said, well, we have 1,000 volunteers that come to the garden and help us to maintain the garden. And this is something that simply doesn't exist in Mexico. There are no volunteers in Mexico because most people simply try to survive.
Yes.
You don't retire in Mexico. Mm-hmm. You just keep working all throughout your life, because if you retire, the retirement is so meager that if any, it will just keep you alive. While in the States there is this there is much more wealth, probably because it has been much used in a much more wiser way than in Mexico. Corruption is in very different levels, and the use of natural resources has followed a very different path in Mexico and in the United States. But if we had 1,000 volunteers associated to El Pinacate, gosh, you will have a completely different reserve. But there are no volunteers. The volunteers that come to do work, like even picking litter from the roads, are not Mexican. Are Americans. Are American retirees that live in Yuma or some other place close to the border in Arizona, and come to the reserve because they have a deep interest and want really to help the permanence of the reserve. But as a Mexican, that simply doesn't happen in Mexico. And I think that represents a vast possibility of doing things community-wise, because these volunteers do not simply pick up litter in roads, but they have a mind, and and they spread the word, and they talk to other people, and they are concerned with social issues, and they are people that are really intelligent, and really try to find new ways of using resources, or recycling, or reusing, or talking to people simply on this, in this case, on environmental issues. We don't have that in Mexico, and I think that's a major difference. Not only we don't have as many NGOs in Mexico, we don't have as much funds involved in conservation in Mexico, but we don't have this social base of volunteers that are concerned with environmental issues.
And again, economic disparity being the underpinning reason for that.
Yes, for sure. The economic disparity is the driver of most things. Say, why so many Mexicans want to go to work in the States? Economic disparity. And it's a real tragedy, because we are losing all these young people, powerful people, just in the prime of their age, that could make Mexico grow, but instead go to the States, risking their lives, helping the United States grow, despite the fact that there are stickers on the bumpers of cars saying, "Don't lie, show your ID," or things like that.
Incidentally, when we were in Yuma the day before yesterday, we talked to a woman who actually was taking volunteers across the border to work in Pinacate to erase trails that were not appropriate by putting in plants to make it look as if no trail was there. She was in the business of disappearing trails that were not authorized trails. And that's a kind of a good example of what it is you're talking about. And I think one of the bad things about the current border problems that it does discourage elderly people who do some of these things, who are very fit, from taking that trip across the border, which is kind of a bad thing.
Well, in the border, and both sides, we started this by talking about the new legislation here in Arizona. Do you see any impact to the networks and the research and the positive things that have been going on, the work that you've been doing, for example, as a result of this sort of backlash, negativity, xenophobia?
Well, for sure. It reminds me of Kristallnacht, in which there is this xenophobic push to society without recognizing the contributions of that sector of society. And that, of course, makes things do not improve things. Simply, they make things worse, and the avenues for collaboration diminish with laws like that. I really worry about Law 1070. In the first instance, because of Americans. What the OTAN will do if they are confounded with Mexicans and they are asked all the time their ID, being American citizens, for example. And of course, I worry about Mexicans that try to do an honest living in the States, but have opted going to the States illegally because the traditional channels don't allow them to go illegally. Sorry, because the traditional channels do not allow them to go legally. On this workshop, I was in Phoenix, and that was about less than 1 month ago. I was really hesitating in going to Arizona because I don't want to go. And it's not because I'm against controlling illegal immigration, but because I'm against the basic essence of the law that has a strong racial element within it. and I was really thinking in not going. Of course, I just thought of the organizers and say, gosh, they have been organizing it for 1 year. How I will not go? I have to go, but I will not engage in another meeting in the States. But that doesn't mean that I will cut the links with my American counterparts. They are as strong as ever. Simply, I will not go as often. But this is a personal stance. I can even meet. Perhaps will be easier for me, being with my white hair and more academic appearance, to mix with the local populations in the States than some of my students that really look very, very, very Mexican and will be much more harassed on the street by Sheriff Arpaio.
Yeah. I wonder, it's back to this question of how important are face-to-face contacts. And given this period of time, how will these networks stay alive? If they've been based on transboundary field work, people moving back and forth, Richard coming to the Pinacotes, you coming to work with him, Paul Martin taking a walk with you in the Pinacotes. If there's not going to be that, what is it you say that we'll continue to be colleagues? I'm very intrigued by this, at least in part because the academic work on networks say communication is the main thing. Are there shared values or something underlying this, or a long-term commitment that may tide you over not being able to relate in a face-to-face way? What do you think? That's where we began.
The face-to-face encounter is exceedingly important. Even in this age of communication, in which we have this wonderful interview by Skype, there is nothing like driving in the field with David Jedman,
Yes.
my great friend, and talking about 1,000 different issues at the same time and discovering wonderful things in this conversation. It's not only this decomposing thing happening in the States with this racial profiling laws and xenophobia and other issues, but also in Mexico, in which we have all this violence and the drug trafficking gangs making terror on the population. And I understand many Americans not wanting to come to Mexico because they have a real fear. I do have a real fear of going to the Sierra Madre because the effects of violence, you feel closer and closer. Say, now is not something I read in the newspaper, but it happened to a friend of me. And is not helped at all by the current U.S. practices of not recommending American citizens to come to this exceedingly violent country, Mexico. So that is another issue that also impedes these face-to-face encounters that are so rich and are probably responsible for most of the long-term involvement in research, to the sense of place involved in research, and of course to the participation in scientific, in my field, in scientific publications.
Incidentally, when we talked to David Yetman, he said much the same thing and said he'd not been to Mexico in 6 months, although over his lifetime he thinks he may have been there more than 500 times. So that's a sort of indication of what's happened with the present. But back to the question of maintaining things. You have warm and rich feelings about David Yetman, and you carry that experience with you into the future, I suppose that has some lasting power. I don't suppose it does much for new researchers, huh? But is there a way in which this spirit can be maintained in this bad time?
Well, yes, I think so. But it also needs particular personalities. You see,
Okay.
finally we are individuals, and we choose to whom we relate and to whom not. And of course, my involvement with David or Richard or Paul, to mention these three, and there are many, many other people I admire profoundly in Arizona, California, New Mexico. The fact that I have this close relationship with them has not done anything to my academic productivity in the sense in which it is measured today. We haven't had as many papers co-authored or many books in which we have made this deep collaboration. There are some papers, a few, but nothing remarkable. The gain here has been more on the inspiration, on the enlightening, on the discovering of new things or new venues of research when talking to them. And probably I'm atypical in that sense, perhaps like Ezequiel, in which we value this human approach, close approach with our friends or researcher friends in the States, but not always coalesce
Right.
into this publication that is highly valued, particularly if it's in a high impact journal that the chair of my department demands.
Well, I think we can both agree, since we both had a similar experience, that mainstream disciplines and science with a capital S doesn't necessarily appreciate these place-based kinds of research that have a humanistic side, that express certain commitments and values. Nonetheless, it seems to me that maybe it's got something to do with this particular place, and it's certainly the inspiration of this project, that there seems to be an inordinately large number of committed people who over many years are interested in the place. I was very heartened to listen to Ezequiel talk about the American Southwest and his experience. You know, he has this job over in California, but you feel he's perhaps left his heart in the pina coladas. You know, he talks in that way. I wonder if there are other characteristics of such people. Bilingual. Many people said in order to be a long-term activist in this area, you really have to know some English or some Spanish. Someone else said you've got to look beyond your own discipline, and I think in other words you've said the same things, that you have to be interested in what other people know, even if it's not in your own repertoire or in your own research agenda. Are there other things? It's difficult. We're trying to work out this sort of profile of the kind of people. Clearly, Paul Martin is interested in people, isn't he? He cares about...
Yes.
I don't know how many people have said, I learned this from Paul Martin, or I was with Paul Martin when I discovered this. I wouldn't call Richard Felger a people person. But he has much of this same kind of influence. Knowledge,
yes.
deep knowledge is part.
I think it's related to generosity. Say if someone is prepared to share with other people part of their knowledge, is because they, in some cases, it's because they want to take advantage of the situation and perhaps publish something or use the data of the other person. But in the case of Paul, for example, or David, I think it's driven by generosity.
Okay.
Say they share their knowledge without expecting anything else but or Ezequiel, but making the interest or increasing the information on that beloved region to a deeper degree. Say, we all talk about the Sonoran region, or the American Southwest and Northwestern Mexico, as these sort of mythical areas that are full of wonderful places that have this magnetic force that pulls you in, that have these enormous open spaces that you don't see anywhere in North America anymore, that makes the place so appealing and that transcends the need for increasing your publication rate or other things. Say when Paul was pointing these wonderful things, these wonderful ideas to me, I just realized that he was sitting, he was trying to seed, and because he was not telling me only to me that, he was telling to anyone, and he was hoping that that seed will germinate in some of the people he talked to, but he had no selfish interest. He really did it because he liked the region, and as Ezequiel does, and of course as Richard does, despite all this apparent harness or he is very difficult, Richard.
And
but
what about,
he's very generous in many ways.
And what
you
about,
learn so much from him, and he had no interest in telling me things or giving me things when I asked them. And I think that makes a difference.
And you, is this an area that is you similarly for you? We've heard so much in these interviews. It's like I love, it's embrace. You know, this sort of it's the romantic language of this area. There's something drawing. Do you feel that similarly? Is that why you've spent so much of your life in this area?
Oh yes, of course. Yes. See, it transcends basic research. It transcends population ecology or population genetics or whatever or other scientific discipline. It really that's I think that's a major element of this talk.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I really, you've added a lot to our notion of the kind of people who are involved here. We haven't really looked at it from the science point of view, and that's really, really very helpful. One of the things we're trying to do is to make certain that we interview all of the people we ought to be interviewing. And we're a little bit light on the Mexican side. We will talk to Richard Felger. We haven't yet, but we've talked, and Paul Martin. We haven't done that either. And we'll put him on our list. But are there people in Mexican NGOs or in academic life like yourself that you think we should talk to about this?
For example, I was wondering about Maria Elena Barajas. I know she was in the early stages as a government official, in pretty important player, and I would love to get contact information for her. If you have,
I don't know where she is. She disappeared.
Okay.
And I simply lost contact many years ago with her. I'm trying to think of on Mexican researchers involved in the region, and
or activists or NGO people.
We have on our list. As we said, we spoke to Francisco Samara. He recommended Osvel for the Upper Gulf.
Osvel, yes, I agree.
And we'll talk to Joaquin Murrieta, who's now back down in La Paz. Who else were we gonna?
Francisco Zamora.
Javier Esqueda from Pro Esteros.
Is that right?
I don't know him. Luis Burillon could be one.
Luis Burillon we've just contacted him from Kobe. Yeah.
Yes.
Roberto Solomon from Conagua. We thought we'd get some federal officials as well.
Right.
Carlos Valdez is another name.
Yes, he's in Alamos, isn't he?
Yeah.
Carlos Castillo. I think Carlos Castillo is a Mexican officer of now very high profile.
Where is he? He was the first Pinacate Biosphere director, or researcher. He's one of those young.
Yeah, that's right. Now is the regional delegate of northwestern Mexico for CONAM, for the Comisión Nacional de Áreas Protegidas. I think you can get him at C. Castillo altogether at CONAMP, CONAMP dot GOB, be like barrel.
Yeah, burro.
dot MX. I think that's his address. Anyway, I will look and send his email address to you. And
that would be so good. Thank you very much.
He knows me quite well, actually. So we were very much involved when I was with the Sonoran Institute those years back.
Yeah.
So if you met, perhaps. So I guess we just need his contact numbers because he's likely to recognize Wendy.
Yeah, he'll know me.
Yes, sure.
If you think of anybody else that you think...
will be interesting for you perhaps to see what Helen Martinez thinks, because you see, I'm a native Sonoran, and I happen to come back to Sonora and work in the Sonoran Desert. I have this imprinting.
Yeah.
But Hela is a Central Mexican researcher that came to Sonora because her husband, me, was drawn back, and she agreed. She said, yes, let's go there. And you will have a very different view if you interview Hela, because you will have the point of view of a foreigner, a Mexican foreigner, coming to the northern Chichimeca in the Sonoran Desert, say.
Well, perhaps you will put a good word for us in with her, and perhaps also send us her email contact so we could set up something.
If you could email us and CC her,
so she knows who we are and what we're about.
We'll love to set up an appointment to Skype call. You've got an account now. We can call her on your Skype account.
She has an Skype account. She uses much more her Skype account than me. I don't use Skype.
Well, it's kind of a miracle for these binational contacts at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, it is, indeed. And I will think of someone else. The ones you mentioned, I think, are great. And there will be many others, but your list is seems very good.
Excellent.
Good.
Alberto, you look fantastic.
You look too.
It's so good to see your face.
It's been a long time since we last met.
Probably 20 years.
Many years, yes. Yes.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk with you. I've loved interviewing. We've had so many conversations. Helen got to speak to Gary Nabhan, another person, of course, I know you've worked with, and it's just been a fantastic experience. The International Sonoran Desert Alliance, for your own knowledge, is doing amazing things.
I know.
Unbelievable work. I couldn't be prouder of my young baby.
Yes, I know, and I've been following the Sonoran Desert Alliance through time, and of course, always remembering your early work on establishing that wonderful place. I didn't say anything about Gary. Gary has been also very, very, very important inspiration. And we
didn't tape him the first time, but we've decided taping all of these interviews is really important. Just a really wonderful archive, and Joe Wilder has expressed some interest in archiving them for posterity. So
he's the director of the Southwest Center, where Gary.
Joe Wilder has been also another of these people that has this broad interest and has been pulling people into, including me, and telling in a very generous way many ideas, just sharing his knowledge, offering shelter and space from actual parking space at the Southwest Center.
It's true.
To really intellectual space by sharing his thoughts and knowledge as director of the Southwest Center.
That's how I feel about it too. That's why I'm affiliated with the Southwest Center and love it.
Yeah, it's a great place.
Big abrazos.
Muchos abrazos también a ustedes. Helen, it was great. I knew you before.
Yes, I realize that now. Yes,
it's great seeing you. You both look great, and I look forward to see you soon in the future. And you come down to Sonora. It's not as violent as portrayed. You are very much welcome to Hermosillo. You missed the Fiestas del Pitic that happens every May in Hermosillo, and had these great artists coming. You should come next year.
We'll plan on it.
And keep coming back to Arizona. We do not agree with what has happened here in the least.
I know. But all the people I know do not agree. I don't know the ones that agree.
I don't know any of them either. Unfortunately, it's hard to convince people you've never even met, you know?
That's right. I agree.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Abrazos.
Bye-bye.
It was great talking to you. See you then.
Okay. Bye-bye.